Senator, Dato Idris, perhaps this question to you. I mean, how is it possible that the government, the Ministry of Education, which receives the biggest allocation of funds at Budget 2014, 55 billion ringgit or something, can still continue to produce such a staggering percentage of inadequacy at 70%, and which of course raises the specter of leakages. And the second question again is, what is the chances of the government reverting to the use of English as the medium of instruction for the two most important disciplines, which is mathematics and science?
I think when we shifted into Bahasa as the main medium instruction, that is good. I mean, that many countries do that they push their own national curriculum. But if you start doing that, you must make sure alongside that you strengthen the quality of English as a subject. And that's, I think, the point that I think we didn't do as well as we should. And to me, there is tremendous need to do that. We recognize that. And the program now is to strengthen the teaching of English in all schools in Malaysia, both at primary and secondary school. Coming back to the point about ensuring we have the very best teachers, and that is critical for us moving forward. We must remember now, in today's day and age, the use of technology as one of the tools that is readily available. 20 years ago, technology wasn't really there. In Stanford, they now realize that one lecturer, instead of teaching in one classroom, you can then use all his teaching methods and then put them through the system so that they can share that across to many other students. So in Malaysia, we've now acquired the tool that they use in the UK called Frog. So that tool is then, we now try to populate that to make sure that we have all the teaching methods that is done by the best teachers in the country, and then we put it there. It can then be shared to rural places and other places like that. And so when we start using technology to make this happen, I think that's a really important breakthrough project for us to improve quality of education. So it's a transition to make sure you share the very best teaching techniques of the best teachers across the country, because it takes a long time to improve the quality of the 400,000 teachers. You can't go and remove all of the ones that are no good immediately overnight. There's nobody in the classroom. And so you really need to make sure that we have to transition our way towards better quality teachers in the classroom.
Stuart, this must come as music to your ears, because let's just say extrapolating to 10 years' time, and GE is involved in a whole plethora of industries, whether it's defense or aviation or infrastructure or clean energy. Now, where do you think Malaysia has the best chance of building the next global giant, if all goes well in the education sector?
I don't think there's a limit to that. You know, Malaysia already has a very wide array of industries that it competes in. Sometimes domestically, but many times internationally. So they can grow from those strong bases going forward. The talent obviously is key to make that happen. I think oil and gas, clearly a huge strength. Petronas is a world-class company. They're building an ecosystem here in Malaysia that will continue to grow and develop national champions. We talked about Sapura Kencana. There are many others. Bumi Armada. I think the same thing in aviation. The boom in commercial aviation with the emergence of AirAsia here in the region has led to many new jobs, and will grow MRO capabilities. GE is involved in the only commercial engine repair and overhaul facility. We'll see more investments in that space going forward. Healthcare, as the middle class continues to grow in Malaysia, there'll be significant investments really demanded by the population for better healthcare, and that will enable lots of new companies to happen. We see what's happening in the developed countries like the United States and Europe. Biotechnology is one of the hottest areas, and I definitely see that growing here in Malaysia.
Dr. Sander, the joinder you earlier mentioned with regards to Malaysia's high debt levels was the fact that it still needs to address its fiscal position. And given where Malaysia is right now, and the oft-quoted refrain in this sphere has always been the political will to see through the measures or the lack thereof, how would you rate Malaysia's actions in this regard, say the last 9 months?
In the last 9 months, I think we can rate Malaysia quite well. I think that if we look in the last 10 years, I think that what we were discussing before is that you want to make sure that you rebuild the buffers, that you have the right buffers for when you're hit with a crisis. When the economy is hit with a shock, as was the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the fact that the deficit was 6.6% of GDP in 2009, that's what governments need to do when there is a shock to the economy. The question is, what do you do afterwards when the shock starts to dissipate and the economy starts growing again? You need to rebuild the buffer so that when there is a next shock, which is outside of Malaysia's control, the government can again run 6, 7% or however much it needs in order to keep the economy going. So for that, it needs to keep the debt on a declining trajectory. We didn't see so much of that in the mid-2000s. The debt levels remained stable despite the economy still growing 4 or 5%. And in recent years, it has also been quite sticky and a bit difficult for the debt levels to come down. In the last 9 months, specifically, I think that we've seen a lot more resolution in terms of ensuring that the level will finally enter a declining path starting this year, and committing to reducing the deficit gradually over time, precisely to rebuild these buffers that are so important. And if I may quickly, I think that since this is also a fiscal question, you asked about why the budget for the Ministry of Education can be very high and that's not translating into some of the outcomes. And we talk a lot about the need to build human capital. And I think that it's true that, for example, in the area of education, a lot more efficiency can be obtained as opposed to spending more to actually get more out of the existing spending. And one of the ways that when we look at the Malaysia system, one of the reasons that we hypothesize as to why the spending is not translating into outcomes is that it's a very centralized system. And I think that the blueprint recognizes that more of the power needs to be moved to the principals, it needs to be moved to the school level so that the schools can make some of their own decisions in terms of how to best allocate how to best decide on the curriculum, how to best allocate resources, and also to move more information to the parents. What we were talking about, knowing the quality of the teachers in terms of how well they teach English, how well the schools are doing compared to the school next door, so that with that information the schools can demand of their principals and the school leaders they deliver a better quality of education. These are very difficult things to change when you have a very centralized system, but those are things that can actually have material improvements without actually increasing the spend on education.
Dato Idris, you mentioned in the past, and we have seen this, Malaysians have been bombarded by a whole series of cost increases, from assessment rates to toll rate increases, bus fares, sugar, etc., etc. But you have mentioned in the past that perhaps we should have 2 baskets when it comes to rationalizing our structural reforms, which is the essential to-do list, which will move the needle, and the other basket, which is the less essential items. Now, clearly Malaysia should do this and prioritize its rationalization measures. Which to you are the most important, which is the most components of the basket in the to-do list, essential, and what is the ability of the government to prioritize this?
Thank you for that. My response is very predictable. I always believe that we must do the things that move the needle, make the difference. Of course, it's easy to say, put everything up. I mean, even the small things. But I think if you did so, there's a great tendency for those little increases to be so irritating to the public that so the big ones, we wouldn't even have the courage to do them. And so I'm of the view that we should really focus on the ones that really make the contribution to the fiscal position of the country. Petrol, diesel, those are the things, electricity, those are the things that really significantly move the needle. There are many other things that are, yes, they need to do them, but they are small in comparison. And take the example of where in the world would you go to a government hospital and you pay RM1 and then you get 3 months of medicine, only in Malaysia. And the last time we paid that RM1 hospital charge was 1982. That's a long time ago. But to increase that by a few cents, you get everyone riled up. In the end, we cannot even do the petrol increase. That's where the real things are. So returning back to the point, the first basket is those things that move the needle. I think we should focus on doing this. All the KL rates assessment that belong to the second basket. All the bus fares and little things, quite irritating to the public. I think we must focus on the things that really make the difference. Returning back to the point, I think when you look at the health of an economy, we cannot see it from purely one dimension, one ruler. You need to see two rulers. Let me introduce the subject of the two rulers. I call it the matrix. On the y-axis of the matrix is called the national debt, the government debt as a percentage of GDP. So that's the y-axis. On the x-axis, it's the fiscal position, either you're in a surplus or a deficit as a percentage of GDP. So you picture the chart. If you are good as a country, you must make sure that you have your debt levels below, a lot lower than 100% on the y-axis. But you do not want to be in the deficit mode that's greater than 10%. So those countries that are greater than 100% debt level, that are negative in terms of fiscal deficit, at negative more than 10%, they are in what's called the sovereign crisis level. That's when you become bankrupt. Malaysia is nowhere near that. When we first started, you know, our debt levels is still below many other countries. Greece is 100%, even the UK is 80%, and France 81%, thereabout. And Japan is outside the curve, 190%. Singapore, interestingly enough, is 100%. But you know why they're not in trouble? Because they are surplus. It's just like you can borrow money, but if you can have the capability to repay, it's okay to borrow money. And so in the case of Singapore, they borrow a lot of money, but they are actually in a fiscal position that is surplus. And so when we were in Malaysia, we were at the wrong end of the stick. We didn't want to go there. If you look at that chart, actually, we've been moving every single year for the last 4 years, inching into the safe zone. That means safe zone is negative 4% or surplus. That is at the border. And then that we believe that in the safe zone, you have to have a debt level less than around 60%. And Malaysia is actually inching there. Some of the countries that are really struggling, you see India and also Indonesia, they now lately have difficulty with this outflow of capital going out simply because they are current account deficit. When you are in current account deficit, you really have a problem. And so Malaysia, we are surplus at current account, but at the total account, we are reducing that gradually. As I said, negative 6.6, 5.6, 4.8, 4.5, 3.9. So we're moving all inching in the right direction. So the key here is that never look at the fiscal position of a country in one single dimension, the debt level alone, because if you did so, you'll conclude that Singapore is they're in trouble, they're not in trouble, because you need to look at it two dimension, X and Y axis. If you are surplus, it's okay to borrow. But if you don't have surplus, then it's not okay to borrow. It's as simple as that. I sit on the World Economic Forum, and there are about 30 people all across the world on a panel to try and search for what is the right economic model for the whole world in terms of new growth model. Clearly, we are of the view that going forward, countries need to be multidimensional in viewing the position of a country. At the same time, you need to look at high income, inclusiveness, and sustainability, much the same as the new economic model. It's exactly the same. They didn't use the word inclusiveness. They wanted a better word called inclusivity. But it means the same thing. But it's much the same. But it's not, you can sit down and ask yourself the question until your face is blue. You come to the same point. A country that is good must be a country that is high income. At the same time, it must be inclusive. And at the same time, it must be sustainable. So that is the key. And we have a good model going forward. And I do believe that if Malaysia pushes the boundaries and keep doing what we're doing, but returning back to the point about quality of education, critical, and absolutely critical. But need to think about how do we move into the sexy stuff beyond the making the most of what we have.
Dato, you point out the fact that the trajectory is correct, and it is correct, but it's a long-term game, and with the Prime Minister's approval ratings on the wane, and the fiscal, the structural reforms having to take a long time, but this is a long-term game. How highly would you rate the chances of the political will to remain a status quo for the medium to long term?
You see, there is no gain without pain. So when we say we want to improve our country fiscally, we have to take some painful measures. The subsidy rationalization, clearly, I think one way or another, it contributed to a negative view of what our Prime Minister is. But to me, that's the right thing to do. We have to take some of those difficult measures. In fact, when we started to do some of the increases lately, we are really looking at CPI, the Consumer Price Index. For those that don't know it, there are more than 800 items in the Consumer Price Index basket, 800 items. And for those who don't know it, the Department of Stats, on a monthly basis, in fact weekly, they do a survey based on 13,000 retail stores across the country, from Kota Belud, Kuala Lipis, to Murudu, everywhere, 13,000. So the total number of data points, actually, that they're getting out, more than 80,000 data points. So I think the last month cost of living survey, despite all the hoo-ha that's going on around, the CPI is only risen by 3.5%. It's lower than many, many other countries in the region, actually. Now, I know people always want to say, yeah, but I went to that shop and I found kembung price higher than that shop. I think that's anecdotal way of doing it. It's not the right way to do it. You need to take the 800 items, poll 13,000 retail outlets. That's how you then get. In fact, we now have an app that I don't know when it's going to be out. It's out. If you go to the app, what's it called? Price check. The app you can key in the exact item that you want to put there, and you put in the location, and then you will give you the exact price, actually, country by country or state by state, town by town. So all the 800 items, so that we in Malaysia become a little bit more educated. Returning back to the point that I know there are people that come out and say, oh, the world has collapsed. Cost of living has gone through the roof. I said, calm down. The world hasn't collapsed. You know, it has gone up, but it's manageable. It's at 3.5%. It is manageable. But let's not simply, on the basis of that, forget the fact that we need to do the subsidy rationalization. We need to do the subsidy rationalization. We cannot continue along this path because that's a very significant drain on the fiscal position of our country. Those money can be usefully spent on developing our education system, making sure that we have the right public transport, and all other woes that exist in living in Malaysia that currently exist.
Stuart, over the long term, NGE will be an investor as well as an employer in this country. Now, with energy costs rising, with utility costs rising, and will continue to rise for the long term, wages, of course, are rising as well. How does this affect your decision-making process when measured against the related benefits that come later on down the line when it comes to investing in Malaysia?
We are, first of all, we invest in technology so that we have fairly high margin businesses. And so we're happy to pay market, and when I say market, global market prices for electricity and fuel. We are opposed to subsidies. As I think Dato Sri has made the point very clearly, subsidies is a very bad way of doing income redistribution because it helps everyone, including people in the middle class and upper class. And it's that's bad policy. The other thing it does is Malaysia's got huge potential for renewable energies here. But when you're subsidizing fossil fuels, renewables can't compete. So if you're going to build a renewable industry, you need to make people pay real cost for petrol and other fossil fuel related products. So I think that is that's critical. At the same time, obviously, you need to continue to do income redistribution, but it needs to be for only the people that need it.
Dr. Sander, sorry.
No, I just want to pick up on this. I mean, I fully agree that it's important that we replace the untargeted subsidies which distort consumption, it distorts incentives away from moving to renewable energy and more energy efficiency into more energy intensive types of industries. So it's just in general is the right kind of policy to do, but without forgetting to target better some of this assistance to the ones that are really needed. And to go back in terms of the issue of the fiscal policy going forward, I think that what is really important, especially for foreign investors, is the direction of policy. As we said, is whether the deficit continues to come down and whether there's a credibility that the deficit will continue to come down. And so for that, I think that the political will to continue with some of these reforms is also quite important. And then just finally, that we should also look beyond just the fuel subsidies in terms of the fiscal policy. That's good fiscal policy because a huge part of the government spending is actually outside of the fuel subsidies. But also, I think that it's important for the population to feel that there is a shared burden, that they are being asked, to help by not relying on the fuel subsidies so much, but that the government also tightens its belt in other areas outside of the fuel subsidies.
Dr. Sandhu, that's a very good point, because the historical standpoint when it comes to subsidies in Malaysia is the fact that the increases have been placed squarely at the hands of the consumer, higher petrol prices, etc. But where the idea of subsidies may be perhaps examined, and you might have a view on this, is the fact that a lot of the producers, for example, just citing power generators, for example, PPAs, the first generation, of course loaded with loads of producer subsidies. Now, should Malaysia look at re-examining the way subsidies are structured in this country and perhaps dismantling some of those subsidies to essentially corporations who don't really deserve them in the first place?
That's a very loaded question in some ways, but I think that as Stuart was saying, I think that mispricing of energy very broadly, whether it's fuel, whether it's the gas for the power producers, whether it's electricity, the only type of electricity subsidies that we support that we find to be targeted is the very small amounts to households, up to a very certain, very small amounts. Those every household uses a certain quantum of electricity, and it's the poorest households that tend to use only that very small quantum. But beyond that very small quantum that only the poor households would use, it should really be market price for all types of energy.
Now, having established, I guess, gentlemen, the fact that Malaysia is on the right trajectory, we are still nonetheless very much a trading nation, and we are still very much dependent on the health of the global economy. Now, Dr. Sandhu, you've identified China as probably the biggest risk to Malaysia's northward trajectory because of the reforms that are taking place, perhaps the corporate bond defaults that are taking place. China is Malaysia's biggest trading partner. How highly do you rate the chances of a slowdown, or in fact a recession in the near future, and how much of that will affect Malaysia specifically?
I'm not the best person to speak on our China forecast, but I don't think that anyone expects a recession in China. I think that the question with China is, is it going to grow at 7% or at 8%? So I think that China will remain a very strong engine of growth for Malaysia and for the rest of Asia. But of course, because China is so big and has become so big both as an economy globally, but also as a trading partner for Malaysia, this 7 or 8% does make a difference for Malaysia's outlook. And one important way in which it does is also through commodity prices. As Dato Sri was mentioning, Malaysia has done very well in terms of leveraging on what it has, and that means a lot of investment in natural resources. If the price of commodities were to come down because of a slowdown in China, that of course would have an impact on the Malaysian economy. But it's the commodity prices are notoriously difficult to predict, and I think that if we look at the futures curve, they look to be quite stable going forward.
Dr. Idris, perhaps we can just get your view on how resilient Malaysia is to a global slowdown, perhaps even led from China.
I think Malaysia is very resilient. For a reason is this. If you look at the anatomy of our GDP, 67% of our GDP is domestic consumption. The bulk of our GDP is actually domestic consumption. More than 27% of our GDP is investment. So trade is actually a very small component, less than 5%. It's net trade. That means export minus import. So it is actually, although we are a big trading nation, the net trade is the one that comes into the account to determine how big is your GDP. That means export minus import, because we import a lot as well. And so if there's a global shock, we still depend heavily on our domestic consumption, because that is 67% of our GDP is domestic consumption. And secondly, private investment still are coming into the country, as I said, growing at 17.5%. annually on a CAGR over the last 4 years is really robust. Then that is being very positive. Let me tell my worry about Malaysia. We need to be fair about what we worry about Malaysia, and I do worry about Malaysia in terms of our net trade. Net trade means not good enough. So if you take a look at our net trade, our export minus our import, it's less than 5% of our, or 7% of our GDP, less than 10 on a good day. That is a concern. Now, what do we need to do? This Global Malaysia series is having this conversation simply because I worry about Malaysia. If we don't have goods and services that are easily exportable and we don't win it out there in the global market, then it's a problem. But it's not gloom and doom. Let me give 3 good examples of real Malaysians who are making it in Malaysia. And I cited it before for those of you who've been to the previous series, and I will repeat it, and I make no apologies for doing that. A gentleman by the name of Nick Azam, he has, and the wife, runs a small example of a small entrepreneur. They make tube amplifiers, guitar amplifiers. And this guy, he's got more than 20 workers, mainly Kelantanese lah. And they produce some of the best tube amp, and they sell it in 71 countries across the world. And so, I mean, this is fantastic example, a small entrepreneur that's doing it. And these guys, if you go to YouTube and type Chiria Tone, you see hundreds and hundreds of customers around the world put in how good this product is. And by the way, I bought his amplifier. I really love his amp. And when I ordered one via the internet, I was customer number 18 on the queue. I was so surprised when I eventually got the delivery to my house. When I looked at the amplifier, it's not made in Malaysia, it's made in Kelantan. It's actually, you know, it talks about the Kelantanese. So that's one example of small. Let me talk about another example. Another medium-sized company. There is a company that produces hydraulic hospital bed. LHK, I can't remember. LKL. This guy, and I went to his factory in Serdang. When I went into the conference room, there was this huge table in there. In the middle of the conference room is the United Nations flag. So I asked him, how come you put United Nations flag, not the Malaysian flags? Look at that little gallery out there. All the countries in the world that we've conquered the market, I put the flags there. There are 40 of them. There's still more to conquer. You know, this is a Chinaman company. All of them are Chinamen inside the shop. There's only one guy that is not Chinaman. The CEO is Mat Saleh. And so I asked him, how come? Because he said they believe him. When he goes to the foreign country, they believe him, not the Chinaman. So he hired a guy lah. So the point is this, because the key for Malaysia is to the large company. You find many examples of the big ones, such as, you know, AirAsia punching above the weight and doing many things outside there. But the point is this. The sad part of Malaysia is that we are vortex into quarreling about all our little economy called Malaysia lah. Good as it is, we're only 29 million people, small. But if you really want to become a high-income economy, you need to think about the whole market out there. How do we conquer the German market? How to produce a product and service like Nick Azam, like that guy just now that I described. And that we needed to do. How do we get the Chinese, the Indians, and the Malays to become one Malaysia, form a company to then make the most of what we have to conquer? But you can't talk about this in a government sense. It is us that collectively is doing it. And so how do we do that? If we all out here only are interested in government contract, that's old school. That is not the way forward. And that's the Samsungs of this world, the Hyundai, they are not vortex in that discussion about the small cake. Finland has done the same thing. Sweden has done the Swiss have made Swiss watches and they conquered the world doing it. That's what Malaysia needs to do. My concern about Malaysia is that our net trade position cannot move beyond until and unless we begin to do it right in our factory and right where we are. And that is the key. And let's not quarrel about this small domestic market called Malaysia. It's good for now, but that's not the game for the future.
Yeah, Dato.
Yeah, perhaps Stuart first.
Oh, sorry. I'm excited when I talk about trade. So, following up on Dato Shree's points and your intro that Malaysia is a trading company and trade is vitally important to continuing growth and prosperity in Malaysia. I'd like to add, we talked about whether China slows, what that impact might be on Malaysia. But the big thing in China right now is they've widened the currency gap, and looks like there's a risk that China's going to go back to the old game of undervaluing the currency, which also has a significant risk to countries like Malaysia that have to compete. United States too, by the way, and my company. And what is a great way to combat that risk? And that's free trade agreements, like the ASEAN Economic Community coming together and the great progress ASEAN has made as a free trade area over the last 15 years. So you build in resiliency there. And then I would also say that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is also a great way for Malaysia to diversify its trading. And then I sit on the board of MITA, so I pay attention to where foreign investment is coming from. And as you probably all know, that of the manufacturing investment that goes into Malaysia, most of that is foreign direct investment today, and has been for quite a long period of time. If you want to ensure that you continue to get foreign direct investment, you need to join free trade agreements. That is the best single proof point that Malaysia is an open trading and investment environment. And TPP is I think, a great way to do that. And I was very pleased to hear the Prime Minister 2 weeks ago at his economic address support TPP in response to a question.
Good points, Stuart. Perhaps Dr. Sander, you had something else to say?
Yes, no, I wanted to pick up on the issue of the global champions, and also not to forget the services sectors. That Malaysia actually has some regional champions in the services sectors. I mean, one of the first transformation programs was the GLC transformation program, where actually a lot of the GLCs in the services sector, whether in the telecoms or the financial sector, have actually gone out of Malaysia and become more competitive and done better for that. I think that now maybe it's time for them to become global champions. Now that they've already conquered the region, can these companies actually become global champions and conquer the German market or go into the US market? And there is a role, of course, for trade agreements in that context. But I think that going forward, looking at how you can export more services is going to be important for Malaysia, which is a trading nation, to replicate its success in manufacturing towards services. And that's still not something that we're seeing. I was just looking at some of the figures for GDP in Thailand and Malaysia, and how trade throughout Asia has declined, right? Because of the global financial crisis, Asian countries which have been, very export-oriented, trade has declined throughout. In Thailand, actually has stayed flat because the loss in the trade in goods was made up by trade in services, whereas in Malaysia, trade in services also came down since the crisis. So I think that's another area that one would want to look at, and maybe one of the places to start is looking at some of the GLCs that have already become regional champions and how they can actually go global, and the companies that are still domestic, how they can go regional. Maybe some of the professional services companies, as we look at AEC 2015, how those companies, they should not be threatened by the companies that are coming in, but really look at the opportunities in the region for them to go out.
Dr. Sanders, is that wise? I mean, in the context of the current account deficit and exports being the engine of growth to drive the current account deficit in the right direction, should Malaysia really be focusing too much on services and less so on manufacturing, given the fact that countries like Germany and, of course, Japan produce goods of very high quality and which can sell for good premiums on the market?
Well, manufacturing and services are complementary. I mean, I think that people sometimes see this as a competition, but actually having, very competitive services help firms like GE. If you have competitive services, that it makes it easier for you to invest domestically and to have a good manufacturing base. And also, one should look long-term. I mean, the investment in the services exports abroad, it may look like you're setting up subsidiaries abroad, and if you just look, very short-term at your balance of payments, you might see, the investment abroad is higher than the investment coming in. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there's a lot of investment in advanced economies that goes out and perhaps more than comes in. And that's almost a characteristic of what is a developed economy, that you actually have more to export and more to conquer in other markets than you need to come into your own market. So I think that a healthy balance is good, and I would not focus so much on the one number.
Thank you. I just want to add to that. I just want us to be very clear. Many of us, sometimes when you look at, suddenly we see, if you see the Bank Negara report, the most recent one, you see two figures. One is the FDI, that means investment that's coming to the country. There's another figure called DIA, direct investment abroad. That means Malaysian companies investing abroad. The fact that that number is greater than FDI, you don't come out and say, oh, they now don't have confidence in the country, so therefore they are putting it abroad. I agree with Frederico. The fact that we are more than 50% or 60% of our sectoral GDP is actually coming out from the services sector. Services sector is not easily exportable. As you know, unless you actually go there, you don't manufacture something out here and then sell a financial service. You have to put up the bank there in that country. So that is what is happening today. It's a large chunk of DIA actually moving out there, investing in those other countries. As Frederico had mentioned, we're still bringing in a lot of investors into the country. There's still a lot of investments in the country. As I said, it's a real increase in that number. But let's not condemn the GLCs when they start going abroad. So it's good for them to go abroad. There's a lot of numbers that many of them are beginning to do it, because we need to become global champion. In the world that is future, it cannot be jago kampung lah. We need to go out there and make it there, out there. So some of the companies, when they do it, you don't condemn them by saying they are now a traitor. They're no longer interested in our economy. They are going out there investing it because, so that's old school.
Gentlemen, perhaps the last question before we break for the Q&A session from the crowd, and it's really focused at leveled at you, Dr. Sander, in terms of what Stuart brought up and the China's decision to widen its yuan trading ban from 1% to 2%, and of course that perhaps makes people suspicious that China is back to its old game of devaluing the currency, which might spark off another round of currency devaluations around the world. Now, against Malaysia's position as a trading nation and against Malaysia's ambitions to regionalize, how much of a risk do these currency developments in the last few weeks, will it affect Malaysia's plans along this line?
Well, I would look at it more on a forward-looking basis and in the context of the tapering of the U.S. Federal Reserve. I mean, I think that everyone agrees that the exceptionally accommodative monetary policy of not just the Fed but also the European Central Bank, that there was something that was needed at the time of crisis, but that there was a time when this would have to be unwound. And as this liquidity is withdrawn, that of course has a lot of consequences for emerging market currencies. Because if you have a lot of supply of dollars, then the dollars become less valuable. Now, if you take some of those dollars out of the market, right, the market tendency is that those dollars become more valuable. And because the price of the dollar is relative to the price of other currencies, that means that other currencies that may have appreciated since the crisis, they may actually depreciate. Now, the variation in different currencies, I mean, I think that would depend very much on a case-by-case basis. In the case of Malaysia, we saw that there has been some volatility, but certainly not to the extent of what we've seen in other countries. Of course, it's important to manage the volatility, and we'll see, how orderly this withdrawal of liquidity will be going forward. And there are some risks associated with that. But I think that as a general principle, the fact that the ringgit has been depreciating, actually that kind of helps jumpstart the export engine again, which will be needed to make up for the domestic demand, which might be suffering from the subsidy rationalization, some of the other headwinds. To the extent that the weaker currency helps the exports, there will be a positive. And I think that there it's really the less whether it's weak or strong relative to the Chinese or the regional currencies, because if you look historically, those currencies do tend to move pretty much in line. But how it fares with respect to the euro or the US dollar, which are the kind of the export markets where you want to get your products into, as those markets are now recovering and the economy there is performing better.
Gentlemen, thanks for your thoughts and your opinions. Perhaps it's now time to switch back to Frida Liu and further field the crowd for questions.